Hello, my name is Daniel Emerson, and the topic I'm talking about today is misdiagnosis of autism spectrum disorders in certain populations. So the first half of the presentation will talk about what autism is and really the research that I found when I was doing this project. And the second half of this presentation will be about what autism is and the various history of autism spectrum disorders. So what is autism? Autism or autism spectrum disorders refer to a range of conditions characterized by challenges with social skills, repetitive behavior, speech, and nonverbal communication, to name a few, as well as by unique strengths and differences. Now, we know there is not one autism, but many types, caused by different combinations of genetic and environmental influences. And Michelle has said in class before, when you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. So that means that there's a spectrum on which people with autism generally fall. And there's a wide variation in challenges and strengths possessed by people with autism. Now, autism, most obvious signs tend to appear between around 2 and 3 years of age. And in some cases, it can be diagnosed as early as 18 months. Some developmental delays associated with autism can be identified and addressed even earlier. So, in the first topic, an article that I talked about and read was varieties of misdiagnosis in autism spectrum disorders. And the relationship between autism spectrum disorders and psychiatric disorders is a topic of interest, but it really doesn't have that many studies out there. The authors of this study attribute the misdiagnosis of autism spectrum disorders as psychiatrists' inexperience with the population and a culture that requires providers to apply a diagnosis to justify a hospitalization. So symptoms of autism often overlap with different mental illnesses, such as schizophrenia, for example. Both groups can have trouble with reading social cues, identifying emotions in other people, and this could cause people to come off as odd or disjointed. People with autism spectrum disorders, as well as those with schizophrenia, can also have repetitive behaviors. The other article that I read was lack of diagnosis of autism in Hispanic and Latino populations. So some of the areas in which research is most needed to determine the rates at which Hispanic people are diagnosed or not diagnosed with autism include socioeconomic factors, or a healthy immigrant effect and cultural resiliency, healthcare delivery, which entails difficulty communicating with or bias among healthcare providers, and finally, biological, or genetic susceptibilities to the development of autism, or to environmental exposures that may alter neurodevelopment. So some of the socioeconomic community indicators talked about in this study explain the higher diagnosis of communities with non-Hispanic whites, but failed to explain the lower rates in predominantly Hispanic school districts. In an article written by Alan Zarembo of the Los Angeles Times in 2011, he profiled an individual, Amber Diaz, and her son, Chase. Psychologists diagnosed 2.5-year-old Chase with autism and recommended immediate services for Chase. But when Amber tried to access services through the state-funded agency, she was told that Chase only had a developmental delay, which he would soon grow out of. It was not until Amber threatened a lawsuit that the agency decided to provide services. As you could see by this chart, the prevalence of autism spectrum disorders has increased exponentially since 1975, from about 1 in 5,000 in 1975 to 1 in 110 in 2009. This also carries over to people in California, where spending on services for people with developmental disabilities have also increased at an exponential rate. That state alone spends around $638 million on autism-related services alone. Autism was first described by Dr. Leo Kanner in 1943. Now, Dr. Kanner and other professionals believed that people with autism belonged in institutions and only in institutions, which is similar to what we talked about last week with Willowbrook and other institutions. Now, a year later, in 1944, Hans Asperger wrote a similar study to Dr. Kanner with individuals with higher verbal and cognitive capabilities. This was where the separation of autism spectrum disorders and Asperger's came from. So even as recent as 1974, one researcher said this about people with autism. You have a person in a physical sense. They have hair, a nose, and a mouth. But they are not people in a psychological sense. This was written by Ivar Lovaas, an integral person in the development of applied behavioral analysis, which is one of the leading interventions with people with autism. So in this video that I'm going to show now, it takes place at a school in Meriden, Connecticut at Hanover Elementary School. And the social workers and occupational therapists have worked to create a sensory input room to work with children with autism spectrum disorders.
Research shows that if the student's in the right mindset and they get their sensory needs met, they're going to be much better learners.
Hands to your heart space. Take a deep breath in.
The sensory room is probably my most important piece of the day. Students go to the sensory room in order to calm their bodies and get all the emotions out and stabilize themselves so they're ready to learn and they're happy.
When we designed the sensory room, we actually took the entire room apart. We carpeted the floor so that we could absorb some of the sound. We put the shades on the ceiling to change the light. So when they walk in that room, they feel the change.
My class specifically, we utilize the room once a day for a 30-minute break.
First thing that they do is go on the ball and they bounce to a metronome. It's really a way to ground them into the space and give them some sensory input before we have them go out into the room.
We're going to do our rotation now, okay?
So there's different stations in the sensory room, and some of my students love specific stations. One in particular loves the punching bag and the ropes. He's able to get all that anger and frustration out, so that calms him down. Whereas another student, I know he needs calming movements, so he's on the swing going back and forth.
Another area in the room is the crash pad. You will see students that have sensory issues bump into walls, bang their head. So what we've created is a safe space to crash into. And then there's the light wall. You could use your hands, you could use your feet. There's different games that are programmed on there.
That's the girl.
We also work on balance and coordination. The walking path works on all of those, and they have to right themselves, correct their body in space. We have 10-pound slam balls. Some students just need to come in, pick something heavy up and throw it. That's the essence of a sensory room. You're putting materials in there that are appropriate, so students not throwing a chair. And at the end, when they finish with their stations, they lay on the floor and they're squished. So everything that we do in there is predictable. There's a set sequence.
We're all done with sensory room. We're going to walk back to our class.
So after the sensory room, they're able to focus more. They're quieter and their hands are to themselves, and they're able to listen to my directions. We're here, we came from the sensory room, we're ready to learn.
How does the sensory room make you feel? Happy.
All right, well, thank you again for listening and watching this video, and happy Autism Awareness Month.